Our politically incorrect segment tonight, our next guest was walking the streets in her hometown of Pasadena, California, when she and a friend saw an advertisement on a chalkboard outside Pasadena's Church of Scientology for a free personality test. Curious, particularly given the recent infamy Leah Remini has brought to the church via her A&E documentary, the two girls entered the church to see what they could find. With me now, staff writer for the Federalist, Bre Payton. Bre, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bre, this was so brave of you. I'd be afraid they wouldn't let me go if I walked in. What did you see when you walked in those doors?
Sure. So when I went in, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, I went in to take the free personality assessment and just kind of see what they tell people and what their elevator pitch is to get people to join the church, give them massive amounts of money, and sometimes even sever relationships with their families. So I wanted to know what they tell them, right? So I went in, we took the personality assessment test, which was like it was like a Scantron quiz kind of a deal where we answered questions about our character flaws, if we were good at obeying and taking orders.
Oh, goodness.
And a lot of the questions seemed to suss out, and a lot of the questions seemed to suss out how confident we were in ourselves, which is kind of a theme that I touch on at several points in the story. And
right, that's super weird. It's almost like they're looking for your points of vulnerability so they know how they can exploit you.
Yeah, that's exactly what this test is, right? So after I did take this test and went over the results of my personality test with my tour guide, he pointed out that I am a critical person, I am an anxious, nervous person, and that my thoughts are scattered a lot, which are all true. I mean, you have me on every week, you know that these are my character flaws.
I mean, isn't that isn't that literally part of your job title to be critical? That's why we have you on the show.
Yeah, and to have scattered thoughts so we can pay attention to things all the time.
Right,
it's just,
right.
It's part of it, right? So he asked me, what are you going to do to fix these things? The church can fix this for you. The church can fix all of your problems. You know, you just have to dedicate a certain amount of money, a certain amount of time to work through the levels in order to become your best self. So that's really their selling point is, here's all these problems that you have and that we've evaluated in this test, and here's how the church can fix it. And when I responded that I thought I was fine, my tour guide was kind of appalled. He was a little appalled, and he was like, oh, well, you're not going to do anything to fix these problems. You're not going to keep coming back to the church. And then he confided in me that he scored very low on the communication portion of the test, and I scored like the highest score you could get on there because that's also literally my job is to communicate, right? Anyway, he pointed out that he had problems communicating, and all three of the individuals that I talked to in the church all said that they were poor communicators, not very confident before joining the church. One dropped out of high school because he didn't want to read something out loud in front of his history class. So these are all individuals who, seem rather vulnerable when they first came to the church, and they all mentioned that they had problems and that they sought out the church for help to fix these problems.
No, that's very interesting because one of the things I've wondered about the Church of Scientology, particularly given the infamy, like I said in the introduction, that Leah Remini has brought to this. I think we've all watched that documentary. It's absolutely fascinating, but I wondered how they reeled people in because from the outside, Scientology seems absolutely insane. Like it's obviously a scam. How could anybody fall for that? But it's interesting if one of the first things they do is address your vulnerabilities, ask you what you're not confident about, and then promise you can fix it, because that is very appealing to people. Let me ask you though about these tour guides. When you were talking to them, and I believe you and your friends each were assigned a different tour guide, did they seem brainwashed to you when they were talking to you?
No, I mean, they seemed like a normal person that you would talk to, but a lot of the things that they were saying was rather questionable, right? Like my friend, when her tour guide told her that she should stop taking antidepressants and other, prescribed behavioral medication because it would interfere with the Dianetics courses and interfere with the church's practices, and that she should stop it immediately. And then he bragged to her that he was able to get a schizophrenic man to stop taking his medication a week earlier. And that's very consistent with what the church says.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's something to brag about.
Psychiatry. Right, yeah. But that's consistent with what the church says and what they believe about psychiatry, and they really do think that the church can fix all of your problems. And it was interesting, at one point I asked just a simple question, hey, do you guys believe in a deity, right? That's a pretty straightforward question. But when I asked that, I was directed to this very elaborate display with like an interactive touchscreen TV monitor that explained that Scientology first basically begins with being aware of yourself and developing an awareness of yourself and being being the best person that you can be. And then that awareness kind of expands towards the people around you, your family, your loved ones, and then that eventually expands to taking care of the planet and humanity as a whole. And then eventually you get to a deity somewhere along the line, which I thought was rather interesting.
Right.
Well, it's an inversion of what you and I believe, right? You and I are both, well, you're Catholic and I'm evangelical Christian, but we both believe that Christ and Jesus come first.
Right, and most of the time when you directly ask a church or an ambassador of a religion what they believe, they're like, let me tell you about Jesus. They're not vague about it. Usually it's too direct. It makes you uncomfortable. That's very interesting, I think, that they handle it in that way, because in the documentary by Leah Remini, they say, or she says that until you get to the highest level, I have no idea what it's called, the highest level of, self-awareness or whatever, that's the only time that they tell you, actually, God's not real, according to their religion, that they just led you to believe that God was perhaps real throughout the whole thing. So it's a scam, it's a fraud, it's incredible. One last question, did they try to sell you anything, or how did they try to get you to stay if you said you weren't interested?
Right, so my tour guide wasn't as pushy as my friend's tour guide. He suggested that I should buy L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, and I politely declined. But my friend's tour guide really was pushing this book on her and saying, you really need to buy this book. If you don't buy it, then the people who come in here and don't buy the book, they never come back. And she responded, okay, well, when I go home, I can just buy this on Amazon. And he was like, oh, you know what, you really shouldn't do that. You really shouldn't Google this book. Because I'm afraid of the results that are going to pop up. You shouldn't read what the internet says about the church. You shouldn't trust the internet, right? And I think if any belief system or religion is telling you just a blanket, don't trust the internet, I think that's probably a good warning sign to get out of there.
Right, I think that's part of the definition of brainwashing, perhaps. Don't think for yourself, don't research it for yourself, just listen to what we have to say. Bre, very interesting takeaway. Thanks for sharing your experience with us. It was quite interesting.